Hello, and welcome to Stories from India. This is a podcast where we talk about myths, legends, and folk tales from India. I am your host, Narad Muni, and am a mythological character myself. I have the gift of eternal life and knowledge of the past, the present, and the future. By profession, I'm a traveling musician and a storyteller. So the way I'm doing my job is by podcast. In this episode, we are continuing the Mahabharata. We did a number of peripheral stories, but it has been many months since we were in the main storyline of this great epic. In that main storyline, we have done many stories about the education of the Pandav and Kaurav children. Well, there are many more stories around that time in the Mahabharata. But if we try to cover them all, it might take an actual lifetime. So we'll skip forward a bit. We'll still cover more stories from the Pandav and Kaurav childhood, but we'll keep coming back to those in future episodes. Today, we'll see a pushy father get preferential treatment for his son, irrespective of how undeserving his child might be. With the succession to the throne at stake, there was a little more drama in this royal family than, say, the British royal family. And that includes more name-calling in public and in private, more character assassinations, and more direct, outrageous actions. And without journalistic mudslinging. Let's do a recap of the story so far. If you haven't heard any of the Mahabharata episodes before, it might be a good idea to check them out. Those previous episodes are linked in the show notes and on the site, sfipodcast.com. But anyway, here's a quick summary of the story so far. The Mahabharata is one of the two greatest epics from India. The other is the Ramayana, which we have also covered. The Mahabharata starts with Bhishma, the crown prince of Hastinapur. Bhishma made a promise that he would not marry or have children. He did this just so that his father could marry Satyavati, a ferry operator. He also promised that Satyavati's unborn children would sit on the throne. The people of Hastinapur had mixed feelings about this. Some were upset because Bhishma was a very capable warrior and had all the makings of a fine ruler. But others thought they dodged a bullet. A prince putting his empire in danger just because his father had discovered romance in his retirement years? But that's how the story continued. Satyavati's children and then grandchildren faced tragedy after tragedy, and the situation evolved into confusion. Dhritarashtra, who was born blind, became the ruler after his brother, Pandu, abdicated and later passed away. Dhritarashtra's was largely a ceremonial role. Bhishma did most of the actual administration, as he had sworn to do in support of whoever sat on the throne. Dhritarashtra had over 100 children, and Pandu had 5 sons. All those children were physically healthy and fully qualified to be emperor. The problem, which lacked extreme clarity, was should Pandu's son Yudhishthir rule, or should Dhritarashtra's son, Duryodhan, rule instead? Yudhishthir was older than Duryodhan, but Duryodhan was the eldest son of the current emperor. No one clarified this, and it would have saved a lot of lives if they had. The Pandavas and the Kauravas grew up under the tutelage of Dronacharya. Each child found something to be passionate about. Arjun, the Pandav, was an expert archer. Bhim, also a Pandav, and Duryodhan were each the strongest amongst their siblings. We'll continue the story there. But instead of going back to the kids at Dronacharya University, we'll instead go to a parent-teacher conference. Dronacharya himself was in conversation with Dhritarashtra, Gandhari, Kunti, Bhishma, and Vidur. Practically the whole gang was here. Dronacharya, the professor, was describing how the kids had done a fabulous job in defeating Drupad. The professor claimed that the battle with Drupad had more to do with testing the kids than avenging an insult to himself many years ago.
But don't worry, Dronacharya added. I'm sure Narad will cover all that in a future episode, so you can get the full details.
Dhritarashtra wanted to change the topic quickly to something that he cared passionately about. So, Professor, he began, when are my kids done with education?
Learning is a lifelong process, Your Majesty, Dronacharya said. A person is never done learning, and a professor is never done teaching.
Gandhari rolled her eyes, but no one could see that because she had taped them shut. Yes, Professor, we understand. But what my husband is asking is when our children will be ready to graduate.
Ooh, they still have a long journey ahead. It will take many more semesters. I haven't even designed some of the courses.
As I mentioned, Gandhari had blindfolded herself. This was in supposed solidarity with her blind husband. But despite not being able to see the people that she was talking to, she was remarkably perceptive. She knew exactly how to motivate Dronacharya. That's too bad, Professor. We were thinking that once the kids graduated, we could fund your very expensive weapons research project that you had been asking about. But I understand if you want to continue teaching them longer.
Did I say long journey? I only meant that in relative terms, Dronacharya said. Of course, I have crash courses lined up. They'll graduate in no time. Yudhishthir and Arjun and Bhim especially. They are exceptionally bright boys.
That last remark made Dhritarashtra visibly uncomfortable. Kunti was happy to hear that, of course, but she didn't say a word. She was relying on Dhritarashtra and Gandhari for sustenance. Dhritarashtra spoke up with more than a trace of annoyance. Of course, Professor, we must not take shortcuts with such bright children. Let them have the full education they deserve. In fact, I would personally sponsor their PhDs and highly encourage them to continue studying. I am only worried about Duryodhan. He seems less gifted for academia. Why not let him graduate? He can sit on the throne, relieve my burden a bit. There was a long pause. No one spoke. What's wrong? The emperor asked. Why don't you say something? Uncle Bhishma, don't you agree? But Bhishma was able to weasel out without providing an opinion.
You know, I can't have a say on who gets to be emperor. I already made a decision not to make that decision, he said.
Convenient excuse, grumbled Dhritarashtra. What about you, Gandhari? In your view, don't you think Duryodhan is ready to rule? But Gandhari replied that anything she might say might imply a mother's bias. So she'd better sit this one out. Also, she didn't know what Dhritarashtra meant by in your view. She didn't have a real physical view, thanks to her being blindfolded. No thanks to him. Kunti said the same thing as Gandhari. Not about being blindfolded, but about a mother's bias, just applied from the opposite perspective. That is to say, she lacked a mother's bias to comment on whether Duryodhan was fit to sit on the throne. Professor, you should have an opinion. They spent more time with you than the rest of us, the emperor asked him.
But, Your Majesty, how can I play favorites?
Nonsense, Dhritarashtra said. Of course teachers play favorites all the time. GPA, rankings, what are they for?
GPA? What is that?
Dronacharya asked, genuinely puzzled. Dhritarashtra was getting exasperated. GPA, grade point average. It's a grading process for applying standardized measurement to quantify a student's academic achievements. How exactly have you been evaluating our kids at school? Dronacharya shrugged.
Pass or fail. That's the norm. Simple binary decision. No grey area in between. GPA, huh? I don't know. I just don't ever see it becoming mainstream.
Finally, Dhritarashtra turned on the one person who had not spoken yet. Vidar, you tell me, is Duryodhan ready to sit on the throne? Directly addressed, Vidar had no choice but to speak. And because he always spoke the blunt truth, he did that this time as well.
Duryodhan is vile. He lacks judgment in the simplest of situations. He actively works to undercut anyone who opposes him in the slightest. He's like a mob boss, and he demands loyalty.
Dhritarashtra absorbed that for a moment, and then said, So what you're saying is that he's ready for a career in politics?
No, Your Majesty. Quite the opposite. No one with his personality can ever become a leader of a country. You are blinded by your love for Duryodhan.
Don't be absurd, Vidar, Dhritarashtra said. I was born blind, and that too because of a clerical error. Don't you dare blame my son for my blindness.
That's not what I meant, Your Highness. Let me be absolutely clear. Duryodhan isn't going to do a thing for the good of the public. With Duryodhan on the throne, there will be a palace revolt. Your empire will collapse. And meanwhile, he will be sipping wine with his brothers and playing the fiddle.
Dhritarashtra was surprised. I didn't know Duryodhan could play the fiddle. My boy is full of surprises. I must hear him next time. It was Vidar's turn to be visibly frustrated.
Read my lips, Your Majesty. On second thoughts, you can't. But hear me clearly. Duryodhan does not deserve to be emperor.
Dhritarashtra was upset, as you might expect him to be.
All right. Do what you want. You want to put Yudhishthir on the throne? Do it. What do I care? Put Yudhishthir's slippers on the throne for all I care.
They did it in the Ramayana with Ram's slippers. Why shouldn't you?
But don't say I didn't warn you. You just wait and see.
He stormed off. Or he pretended to. He quickly hid around the corner so he could eavesdrop on them. Or he thought he did. Being blind, he didn't realize that he was clearly visible from the window. It was a little embarrassing for the rest of the crowd to see Dhritarashtra standing right outside the room, making increasingly fainter walking sounds, trying to give the impression that he had walked away. Bhishma decided to intervene quickly, before Gandhari could say anything. He had to protect the emperor, but not just from physical harm, but from embarrassment too.
The emperor isn't here. There is no point in discussing this further today. Let's talk to him about it again tomorrow.
Everyone got the message and dispersed. But they were tactful enough to let Dhritarashtra slink away before they exited the room. That night, Dhritarashtra and Gandhari had a conversation. She told him, "Look, I really think Vidur made a good point.
I can't look. I'm blind. But you're just being biased like everyone else."
No, dear, you're the one who is biased. Every day, it is Duryodhan this, Duryodhan that. It's like you don't even have your other children.
What are you saying? Dhritarashtra said. Of course I know my other 99 children.
101 other children, Gandhari corrected dryly.
I obviously knew that. I was just testing you to see if you knew that we had 101 other children. I know them all very well.
Oh yeah? Gandhari asked. Last weekend when I challenged you, you could only name 10 of your other kids. Dhritarashtra got a little hot under the collar. A, that's not true. B, I could name 12 and not just 10. And C, it doesn't even matter because I have my own nicknames for every one of them. Nicknames like number 38, number 39? Gandhari asked. Those are perfectly okay names, the emperor protested. Anyway, going back to a much more important thing I want to discuss, it's a request from Duryodhan and Shakuni. Gandhari was alert. A request? What is it?
A request, Gandhari, is an act of asking politely or formally for something. I'm surprised you didn't already know that.
Naturally, he didn't see her shaking her head. He continued explaining that he guessed Duryodhan and Shakuni had heard through the grapevine how everyone wanted Yudhishthir to become the crown prince. And Duryodhan and Shakuni wanted to do something nice about it. Gandhari was at the edge of her seat. If Duryodhan and Shakuni thought about it, there must be some malice here. The boy was a bad influence on her brother. She would have to warn Shakuni to keep better company. Dhritarashtra continued explaining.
So they are asking for funds to build a palace. Not just for Yudhishthir, but his brothers and for Kunti as well. Isn't my boy sweet? And so clever. He wants us to integrate better with the tribes of the land. So he wants to give the palace a bit of a tribal feel. It'll be made of wax, bamboo, straw. Gandhari didn't like the sound of that.
Hadn't the three little pigs discovered what a bad idea it was not to use bricks and stone? But Dhritarashtra objected to that interpretation.
Who's going to blow down the palace? The big bad wolf? I've never liked that story. How can a pig build anything? With its feet, it can't hold hammers, nails, and stuff. Maybe that's the real reason their huts broke down. Typical capitalist motive, blaming it on building material.
And what did you tell him? Gandhari asked.
Oh, of course I granted their request. What a thoughtful boy Duryodhan is. I don't understand Vidur's reservations. This is a clear example of my boy showing how much he cares about every one of his subjects, not just the ones who live in the capital. Gandhari was still apprehensive. Like Vidur, she still had reservations. But on the surface of it, she couldn't say anything now, could she? There had to be a catch. But what was it? Dhritarashtra went on and on about how Duryodhan had described his clever idea. The boy said that he got his idea after visiting Madame Tussauds' wax museum. Yeah, the very same one that accidentally got burned down last week. But anyway, wax. It looked so nice on all those statues. So why not make a palace out of it? It would be nicer than silly old brick and stone. Dhritarashtra said, maybe for the fifth time, that he thought it was an absolutely clever idea. Of course, he continued, I've already approved the request. They're probably starting construction tomorrow. I do hope that the Pandavas can see that Duryodhan really means well and wants to take care of them. He's a shining example for what it means to be an older brother and an emperor. Yes, indeed. This palace of wax is going to be amazing. I know I won't be able to see it, but I'm sure that if it's made of wax, its walls will be pretty smooth to the touch. We'll pause the story here. We'll come back to see what happens in the Palace of Wax in a future episode. Next time, though, we'll do a story about Jayant. Some of you have specifically asked for a story about this son of Indra, whom we briefly encountered in the Garud episode recently. So we are going to do one story from the Ramayana featuring Jayant. Amongst other things, we'll see one possible explanation for the Kumbh Mela's origins. If you have comments or suggestions, or if there are particular stories that you would like to hear, please do let me know by leaving a comment or a review on the site sfipodcast.com or tweet at sfipodcast. You can also find me on Instagram and Facebook. Be sure to subscribe to the show to get notified automatically of new episodes. A big thank you to each and every one of you for your continued support and your feedback. The music is from purpleplanet.com. That's purple-planet.com. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.